My name's Pete Woods, you're watching Hexhamtv, and we're here at Core Music, which is a music shop in Gilesgate in Hexham, and I'm here with Simon Frith. Now Simon is a sociomusicologist and a former rock critic. Quoting from his Wikipedia entry, as a student he read PPE at Oxford and earned a doctorate in sociology from UC Berkeley. He's the author of many influential books, including The Sociology of Rock, Sound Effects, Youth, Leisure and Politics of Rock, Music for Pleasure, Essays on the Sociology of Pop, and on the Values of Popular Music. He's also co-edited key anthologies in the interdisciplinary field of popular music studies, including On the Record, Rock Pop and the Written Word by Routledge, and Sound and Vision, Music Video Reader, and the Cambridge Companion to Pop and Rock. More recently, Simon has edited a 4-volume set, Popular Music, Critical Concepts in Media and Cultural Studies, and published a collection of his key essays, Taking Popular Music Seriously, Selected Essays. He's co-author of a 3-volume work, The History of Live Music in Britain since 1950, the first volume of which was published in 2013. Simon has chaired the judges of the Mercury Music Prize since it began in 1992. His popular music criticism has appeared in a range of popular presses, including the Village Voice and the Sunday Times, and he's taught in the Sociology Department at the University of Warwick and the English Studies Department at Strathclyde University. In 1999 he went to the University of Stirling as Professor of Film and Media, and in 2006 he took up his current post, the Tovey Chair of Music at the University of Edinburgh. He's the brother of guitarist and composer Prof Frith and neuroscientist Chris Frith. Simon, welcome to Hexhamtv. Quite a long introduction there,
yep.
But you've seen
my life flashing before my eyes.
Yes, exactly. You've done a lot in your life, and it's amazing, that we've got people with such expertise in such a small town like Hexham, but we're very glad that you're here living with us and taking part in our community. So Simon, my first question to you is, what is popular music?
It's one of those questions which is, how long is a piece of string? I'll give you two different sorts of answers. One is, popular music is a kind of way of thinking of how the musical world is divided up. So it's not classical music, put it that way. So within the music industry, record companies will have a classical division, which will include film music, and then they'll have a popular music division. And popular music is seen, I suppose, primarily as music for entertainment, and therefore music aimed at a public which doesn't necessarily have to be musical experts to listen or go to the concerts and so on. But obviously a lot of so-called popular music is not in the slightest bit popular, and a lot of classical music is much more popular than a lot of popular music, so it can be a misleading term. And increasingly, I think I'd rather have the concept of everyday music. It's the music that we listen to every day, whether in our homes or in public places, and that includes these days so many different genres of music. You can't really say popular music as a certain sort of music, but you can say it's music that's fulfilling a certain set of functions in our everyday life.
Why is it important?
I think it's important because I don't think we can live without music. And I think it's interesting that virtually all, especially since the development of technology which allows music to kind of travel, not just be heard live, but be heard on recordings or of all sorts, and these days digitally and so on, most people's activities take place through music. It's always been true of activities which had a particular intensity about them, say whether it was a religious service or a celebration like Harvest Festival, music would be part of that sort of celebration. But music has always been a part of what people do for fun and leisure. Dancing, which has been a key social activity, is always dancing to music. So I think music is just there, and you can see that all other sorts of communication seem to need music to enhance them, whether it's adverts, video games. I mean, it's difficult to think of a form of entertainment which doesn't have music in it somewhere. So music is just, so from that point of view, music is just important commercially, socially and everything else. I also believe that music is the most valuable of all human activities, because if nothing else, it involves collaborating with other people. It's a sort of social activity. Musicians have to make music with other people, and they need an audience to make music. Or listening to music is even though we all these days can listen to our headphones and by ourselves and so on, it's still listening to music with other people. Talking about music is one of the sort of central things that people do as social animals, if you put it like that. So I think music is just kind of, for me, music defines what humans are.
So if I was to say who is music for, how would you reply?
Well, obviously it would depend on the different music. So a brass band playing a march once upon a time was for an army to march in step, and nowadays is a form of entertainment. So I think music can be used for anything. You'd have to look at each. That's why what you said at the beginning, I was a sociomusicologist, which is difficult. I'm a sociologist, so I've always been interested in how does music work in societies, and it obviously works in many different ways.
You've talked about the concept of bad music in some of your research. What do you consider is bad music?
I think what I was interested in is that in academic life, it's felt not quite right to talk about bad music because, all music is music. But I was feeling rather than many social circumstances, people say that's bad. I mean, if you're a musician and you're sitting in the studio, your fellow members of the band said, no, that's all wrong. I mean, we're used to, and anybody who's at all interested in music, part of their interest is saying, I like that and I don't like that. So I think bad music is music that doesn't work in the circumstances in which you're listening to it. So some music that might be bad in one circumstance might work perfectly well in another circumstance. So, for example, if you're incredibly irritated by waiting on a telephone for a bank to answer and they're playing classical music, even if you normally like that music, that becomes very bad music because even though its purpose is just to make you don't sit there for hours listening to it. So I think bad music is always social. It's always dependent on context. I don't think there's an abstract thing called bad music. Although obviously, in terms of individual taste, all of us have music that we can't stand. And one of my definitions of bad music is music I put on at home and everybody in the family says, take that off immediately.
Should musicians and performers, should they seek to be popular, or is being popular sort of the death of creativity? Should they just go out and seek to perform for themselves or their audience, however small that might be, or is it important that they try and become popular?
I think that's a very interesting question and depends a little bit on the sort of music. I think all musicians, I mean, obviously there's an exception for everything you say generally, but I think musicians make music because they want people to listen to it. And some music, they want people to listen in certain ways. I mean, if you're making music for dancing and nobody dances, then that's a problem, and you would think that's not quite working right. So I think all musicians have to have some sort of sense of who is going to listen to them, what the circumstances are, and what they're trying to communicate. So in that sense, they need an audience. I don't think they necessarily need to think, I need as big an audience as possible. Especially if I'm trying to find as big an audience as possible, there are companies that says you can't do that because it doesn't fit the demographic. I think once musicians get into that logic, they become uneasy. That's not quite what they're after. So it's not that they don't want to have an audience. It's more that they want to, thinking about an audience is part of what feeds into how they make music. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I got a brother who's a freely improvising guitarist, which doesn't exactly have a huge audience, although bigger than people might expect. And I have talked to him about this because sometimes in that world, there's almost a feeling that if people like it, you must be doing something wrong. but I always thought that's slightly self-deception. but also, often the audiences for that sort of world, often in the audience for all music, actually, there are other musicians. And you're playing with other musicians, and they've got to like what you do. So even when you're just by yourself, you're playing for the musicians who you're playing with. You're all listening to each other, and you don't want to play in such a way that nobody's interested in listening to you. So I think people have always got a sense of audience. And for some sort of musicians, there's a real thrill in thinking you can stand up in front of 250,000 people. If you're Bruce Springsteen, there can't be anything better than thinking you can do that. But not all musicians are making that sort of music.
What role do you think music has in politics of 2016?
And that's a very good question. I think that, broadly speaking, I think music by its very nature doesn't have any sense of boundaries or borders. And I think a lot of what politics of 2016 seems to be about is worrying about where our borders are and who's allowed to cross them and what it precisely means to be English or British or Scottish or European or whatever. And those questions, which I think are important to people for good reasons and important to politicians, I think they're sort of problematic for musicians And for lots of different reasons, musicians have always had to travel to make a living. So it's always been important. Musicians can't make a living just playing in their locality forever. If they're really going to make a living, whatever sort of living, they need to be able to go to other places and play. Musicians, I think, have always, part of what it is to be a musician is to be curious. Musicians hear an instrument they've never heard before and think, that's an interesting sound, I could put that in our music. So I think there isn't such a thing as pure national music or even pure local music. So even, say, within Scotland, Scottish folk music today doesn't sound anything like it would have done 50 years ago, just because of the change of technology, other music, so people are drawing on different sort of instruments coming in and so on. So I think music stands for a kind of sense of openness and almost a utopianism, which I think gets more and more important in the context in which we seem to be living in slightly dystopian times.
How has popular music changed as a result of the internet and social media, do you think?
I think it's changed in ways that for someone of my generation we find problematic and have to learn to think that it may not be as problematic as it seems. One very simple way of putting it is music doesn't seem to matter as much as it used to. It matters differently in everyday terms. When I was young, and you're probably old enough for it to be the case for you, liking music meant buying records and having a kind of real sense of kind of possession and knowledge and so on. But also, funnily enough, it meant having to listen to an awful lot of music you didn't like. Because, if you were listening to Radio 1 or if you were going to, you're going to a local pub, whoever happened to be playing because you want to see live music, you were constantly involved in listening to a lot of music you might not otherwise listen to, which made you have to think about what you did like and argue with people. I think one of the things about digital music is because it's now so easy to access any sort of music. One, doesn't seem to be quite such an investment. I mean, it's interesting in our history of live music research. When I was at school, I was at boarding school, I kind of skived out of school one night so I could queue all night in order to be near the front of the queue for a Beatles concert. It was in something like 1963 or 62. Whereas now, of course, you just sit online and you don't have to do that sort of. It's all much easier, which is good. But that doesn't seem to be, for our generation, that doesn't seem to be quite the same sort of commitment. But I think it also just in terms of being able to listen to any music you want. The thing I most hate about that is it's lovely. I mean, I'm great, I can access all this music. But all these things which are sort of algorithms which tell you if you like this, you'll like that. You can, in a sense, nobody has to listen to music they don't like anymore, and I think that's a big problem.
Yeah. We're moving into a technical world of virtual reality and augmented reality.
Yeah.
What role do you think music will have in that sort of world where we look through our phones and see things that perhaps aren't there, but perhaps can be accompanied by music?
Well, they will be accompanied by music, because I think, as we were saying earlier, I don't think any leisure activity or medium has an impact unless it's got music attached to it. And video games are an interesting example, both because they have music, but also because technologically it was quite a big problem when they started introducing interactive video games where people playing could change the outcome of the plot. That meant that you had to have built into the system that they could change the appropriate music, which is extremely complicated to do technologically, and has put certain constraints on what sort of music you can have. But I no doubt the technology will change when somebody playing a game like that will be able to, in a sense, shape what the music sounds like, even if it's just by thinking about it. So I think music will still be there. All I would say is that I think there's no evidence yet that people are going to find living lives entirely virtually is very satisfactory. And one of the great things that's happened, great consequences of the rise of digital distribution of music and the subsequent decline, was not exactly decline, but profit problems for record companies, is that the live music sector has flourished, because people still feel that live experience, whether it's in festivals or a big tour or even just going to the local pub, still at the end of the day is what people most think music is about.
Mm.